Welcome to the Deep Dive. Our mission here is to take those intricate structures that define the global economy, slow them right down, and explore the subtle, often contradictory forces that shape the lives of nations and individuals. We begin our deep dive today with a quiet hook, a deep paradox that sits right at the heart of modern Ireland, a nation that presents really one of the most striking economic contradictions in the developed world. On paper, Ireland is immensely prosperous. If you consult the International Monetary Fund, the official figures for gross domestic product, or GDP per capita, they hover around $145,000.
Which is an incredible figure.
It's staggering. And this calculation, it places Ireland not just among the rich, but among the absolute wealthiest economies globally. I mean, theoretically, it's surpassing established financial powerhouses like Switzerland, Norway, Singapore, even the United States. On paper? Exactly, on paper. And this sounds like, a definitive, unparalleled economic success story, a blueprint for a small island nation achieving victory through globalization. But here is the quiet, nagging question we must spend time gently unraveling today.
Right.
If Ireland is truly this prosperous, why is its total population standing today at approximately 5.1 million? Still significantly smaller than it was nearly 2 centuries ago. It peaked at 8.17 million just before the Great Hunger in 1841.
That's a powerful contradiction to start with.
It really is. And that historical demographic trend is striking enough, but the current reality, it just reinforces the disconnect. I mean, how can a country be celebrated globally as the Celtic tiger, this beacon of prosperity and high-tech efficiency?
Right.
While at the same time, 7 out of every 10 young people, these are highly educated individuals, aged between 18 and 24, are seriously considering leaving the country.
And not for lack of jobs, which is the usual reason.
Precisely. Their primary overwhelming reason is the presence of a severe suffocating housing and affordability crisis. So our time together will be spent diving deep into the source material to explore these distinct layers of the Irish economy. We want to distinguish with clarity between the real Ireland, the one defined by history, demographics, and the daily cost of living.
And the make-believe Ireland.
Yes, the make-believe Ireland. The statistical entity built almost entirely on the ledgers of creative accounting, international business strategy, and the movement of just massive amounts of corporate intellectual property.
And to truly appreciate the scale of this contemporary paradox, I think we have to set a stable foundation in history first. We need to trace the long shadow cast by the preceding centuries.
Yes, absolutely.
Because the economic trajectory of Ireland has, for so much of the last 200 years, been defined by hardship and, well, mass displacement.
Right.
Prior to its modern status, Ireland was widely regarded as a country just plagued by endemic poverty, by disease, and deep societal unrest. And this condition left a profound, almost indelible imprint on its demographic path, which really sets it apart from almost all other European nations.
And the defining event there has to be the Great Hunger.
Without a doubt. The single most important event shaping this path was, of course, the Great Hunger, beginning around 1845. The social system was already incredibly fragile, and when this deadly potato blight destroyed the staple food source for the rural poor, the devastation was, well, it was horrific.
The numbers are just hard to comprehend.
They are. The sources estimate that this crisis resulted in the tragic deaths of at least 1 million people, which constituted an estimated 11% of the total population at the time.
And while that loss of life was catastrophic in and of itself, the long-term demographic ripple effect proved to be even more significant, didn't it?
It did. In the decade that immediately followed the famine, an additional 2 million people chose to emigrate. They were seeking any opportunity outside of Ireland, primarily landing in North America and Great Britain.
And this exodus, it wasn't a short-term thing. It didn't just halt after the immediate crisis. It established a sustained, centuries-long trend of population decline.
That's right.
It's a crucial point to internalize this demographic reality. The sources confirm that Ireland reached a record low population of just 2.8 million in the 1960s. This ongoing decline makes Ireland the only non-microstate country today in the entire world with a smaller population than it had 200 years ago.
And the population only began to stabilize and, grow again very slowly after 1961.
So even after achieving independence in the early 20th century, the struggle was far from over.
Not at all. Ireland found its economy was crippled. It possessed relatively few natural resources that could power an industrial revolution, and perhaps more critically, it failed to integrate into or even participate fully in the massive post-World War II economic revival.
The one that lifted so much of Western Europe.
Exactly. That failure to modernize meant that Ireland was frequently and regrettably referred to as the sick man of Europe well into the mid-20th century. The sources show that, rather than following the trajectory of rapid post-war rebuilding you saw in West Germany or France, Ireland was just grappling with deeply structural unemployment and chronic emigration.
Which often took its best and brightest.
It did.
It is tempting, though, to look at that period of struggle and just assume inertia. But the Irish government did try to find a way out. They were looking at economic models that seemed successful elsewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And they made a fascinating but ultimately unsuccessful attempt at adopting isolationist economic policies during their early years of independence.
This was inspired by the Soviet Union, of all places.
It was. The intellectual inspiration for this pivot was unique.
Mm-hmm.
The recently founded Soviet Union, which, in its nascent stage, was demonstrating this impressive, rapid industrialization through a highly centralized, protectionist, and isolationist model.
So they tried to replicate that.
They did. Seeking to achieve similar industrial loops and protect their own nascent domestic industries, the Irish government pursued aggressive protectionism. They nationalized or controlled most industries and severely limited foreign trade and investment.
And this is where the policy lesson becomes so starkly clear. While that highly centralized isolationist model could be, let's say, temporarily sustained in the USSR, a country with continental scale, immense natural resources, and a massive population base, it just couldn't be replicated in a small, resource-poor island nation like Ireland.
It was a mismatch of scale.
Completely.
Yeah.
Lacking those necessary traits of scale and internal capital, this protectionism effectively compounded Ireland's existing economic problems. It stifled competition, it led to inefficiency, and perhaps most damagingly, it ensured that Ireland entirely missed out on the benefits of the massive global post-war trade expansion.
The very engine of prosperity for its European neighbors.
The very one.
So the crucial turning point, the moment the Irish government decided to fundamentally change course, that occurred in 1958.
Right, and this decision was largely driven by the work of two men, Prime Minister Sean Lemass and, most crucially, the economist T.K. Whitaker, who authored this groundbreaking white paper, Economic Development.
And Whitaker's paper was a radical repudiation of those previous isolationist policies. It argued that the only path forward was radical openness.
Which must have been a tough sell politically.
Oh, the political opposition was significant. It required abandoning decades of established nationalist ideology in favor of what must have felt like painful liberalization.
But the shift happened. They began the process of privatizing industries, proactively encouraging foreign investment, and critically committing to open trade with the industrialized world. This move wasn't just a minor policy adjustment. It was a fundamental, paradigm-shattering reversal that really paved the way for the radical changes of the 1990s and the eventual rise of the Celtic Tiger.
Right.
So that pivot in 1958, it set the long-term stage for what would become the Celtic Tiger era. But the modern economic structure, the one we are examining today, the one that produces this statistical illusion, was really built on two very strategic and deliberate policy choices implemented later on.
Starting in the 70s and then really accelerating in the 90s. And the first of those strategic choices was Ireland's decision to join the European Economic Community, the EEC, in the 1970s. This decision immediately provided Ireland, which was a very small economy, with barrier-free access to a massive consumer base of nearly 500 million people.
Mm-hmm. It put them inside the tent.
It did. By joining the EEC, Ireland positioned itself within a bloc that, by 2018, represented 18.6% of the world's total GDP. This access, in essence, gave Ireland a kind of political and economic leverage that its small domestic market could never have provided on its own.
It became the gateway to Europe for major global players.
It did.
And the second, and really the magnetic piece of the puzzle, was the competitive tax regime. Recognizing that market access alone wasn't enough, Ireland made a pivotal decision in the mid-1990s. They drastically lowered the corporate tax rate to a headline figure of just 12.5%.
Which was incredibly low at the time.
It was a massive competitive advantage. To put this in context, neighboring competitors, like the UK, had a corporate tax rate sitting at 19%. And rates across much of continental Europe were significantly higher. So Ireland was offering this low-tax entry point into the world's largest single market.
And that tandem strategy open access to the EU market Combined with the lowest corporate tax rate in the developed world, it acted as a powerful magnet for foreign direct investment, or FDI.
And this is the moment the true Celtic Tiger was born.
We saw a massive influx of global heavyweights. High-tech firms like Intel, Microsoft, and Dell, they all established major European headquarters and manufacturing bases.
And pharmaceutical giants as well, like Pfizer.
Right. And this economic explosion, characterized by the economy shifting so rapidly from, agrarian output to knowledge-based services and manufacturing, that's what earned Ireland its famous moniker, referencing the rapid growth rates of the Asian tigers.
And the growth statistics during this initial period were genuinely historic. I mean, between 1995 and 2000, the Irish economy averaged a staggering annual growth rate of 9.4%.
9.4%.
And it continued to grow robustly at nearly 6% annually, right up until the global financial crisis of 2008.
Wow.
Industry, specifically the high-tech, chemicals, and pharmaceutical services sector, came to account for nearly half, 46% of Ireland's GDP. And crucially, it contributed an astonishing 80% of its total exports.
So that cemented the fact that Ireland's economic health was now almost entirely dependent on global trade and the success of these multinational firms.
Completely.
And on the domestic side, there was a temporary feeling of a genuine boom. Unemployment plummeted dramatically, falling from 18% in the late 1980s down to a very healthy 4.5% by late 2007.
Which is practically full employment.
It is. And this growth attracted a new wave of foreign workers, primarily from new EU member states in Eastern Europe, like Poland and the Baltic states, who filled necessary service and retail jobs. Simultaneously, you had young, educated Irish citizens moving into these high-paying financial, professional, and technology sectors.
So for a brief window, it really felt as though Ireland had finally escaped its historical demographic curse.
It did.
However, this domestic prosperity was, even then, structurally limited. And it was during this initial boom that the first serious cracks began to show. The wealth that was being generated by the Celtic Tiger was concentrated. It wasn't distributed evenly.
Right.
A critical 2004 United Nations report really highlighted this issue. It found that Ireland ranked second globally for wealth inequality, trailing only the United States. So while certain urban centers saw spectacular growth, much of the country was really struggling to catch up.
And this uneven distribution, coupled with the rapid influx of capital, it caused significant domestic stress. Inflation started to rise sharply, hitting a peak of 5% annually toward the end of the boom period. And the sources explain that this was a classic example of too much money chasing too few domestic resources, primarily housing and services.
So you start to see prices climb.
You do. Those rising prices push the cost of living in Dublin and other major urban areas up to the demanding levels seen in countries like the Netherlands or Finland, Nordic European price points. Even though Irish wages, while growing, were struggling to keep pace with that relentless inflation.
And this unequal inflationary environment, it really foreshadowed the severe affordability problems that would come to define the country a decade later.
Indeed.
And it is here, as we navigate the shift from the first Celtic Tiger boom into the post-2008 era, that the distinction between the real and the make-believe economy becomes codified. The global financial crisis of 2008, followed by the Irish banking crash, acted as a powerful catalyst.
A moment of reckoning.
It was. Facing economic collapse, massive debt, and a desperate need to restore stability, the Irish government became even more dependent on attracting foreign direct investment. The aggressive tax strategy that followed was viewed not just as an opportunistic economic policy, but really as a necessary evil to keep the economy solvent.
And this necessity is what led to these sophisticated mechanisms of the make-believe economy.
That's right.
So the core engine driving Ireland's statistically inflated GDP revolves entirely around creative accounting. It's used by multinational corporations to legally postpone or minimize their global corporate tax payments.
Right.
And we need to slow down and truly unpack the most famous of these mechanisms, the double Irish tax strategy.
Which is a fascinating piece of financial engineering.
It is. And while the strategy was officially phased out starting in 2015 due to massive pressure from the EU and the OECD, it remains central to understanding the genesis of Ireland's statistical wealth. At its heart, it was a mechanism built around exploiting differences between various national tax laws, particularly residency rules.
So the strategy required two Irish subsidiaries, often referred to as, Irish Company 1 and Irish Company 2.
Just to keep it simple.
Exactly. So Irish Company 1 was established as a tax resident in Ireland, but, and this is the loophole, it was actually managed and controlled from a tax haven like Bermuda. Irish Company 2, on the other hand, was set up as a tax resident outside of Ireland, but its day-to-day operations and legal headquarters were physically located in Ireland.
A bit of a legal fiction.
A complete legal fiction. So Irish Company 1, the one being managed from Bermuda, that's the one that would hold the intellectual property, the crucial patents, the formulas, the software codes, the brand logos.
All the valuable stuff.
All the valuable stuff. So when a global distributor sold a product in a high-tax country, say France or Germany, that local distributor would pay a massive royalty fee back to Irish Company 1 for the use of the IP.
And here's the initial trick. This royalty fee was structured to equal the local profit made by the distributor. So by paying this fee, the local distributing company effectively zeroed out its taxable corporate income in that high-tax country.
And the entire taxable income was thus shifted to Irish Company 1.
Right. But since Irish Company 1 was managed from Bermuda, despite being legally incorporated in Ireland, it paid virtually zero corporate tax on those billions in royalties. It exploited a loophole in Irish law concerning tax residency.
And that's the double Irish. But the strategy often included a third crucial step known as the Dutch sandwich.
The Dutch sandwich.
The Dutch sandwich was necessary to avoid a potential 20% withholding tax on the royalty payments between the two Irish companies. So the money wouldn't go directly from Irish Company 1 to the Bermuda holding company. Instead, it would be routed through an intermediary company in the Netherlands.
And why the Netherlands?
Well, the Netherlands offers a legal provision called participation exemption, which means it typically does not tax income transferred to a subsidiary in a different EU nation. So the funds would flow from the high-tax country through Ireland to the Dutch shell company, and then finally out to the Caribbean tax haven, like Bermuda or the Cayman Islands.
And it would incur zero tax at every stage.
Often, yes. Zero tax at every stage.
So the key takeaway here is that Ireland was the facilitator. It was the necessary stop on the map where the legal IP transfer happened, enabling corporations to pay an effective global tax rate far, far below the headline, 12.5%.
And this meant billions of dollars in revenue flowed, statistically, through Ireland, inflating its trade and balance sheets, but incurring minimal tax liability and providing minimal actual domestic spending power.
Right.
And this complex system, it led directly to the defining statistical moment in 2015, even as the double Irish was being phased out. Apple, in one final massive accounting maneuver, transferred approximately $300 billion worth of intellectual property to Dublin overnight.
The impact on Ireland's reported economy was instant and, numerically unprecedented. Ireland's GDP rose by 26% in a single statistical quarter.
26%.
It was so massive, so unconnected to any genuine domestic output that the Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Krugman, in a moment of just utter disbelief, coined the now famous, slightly derogatory term, leprechaun economics.
And to understand why this IP transfer inflated the GDP figure so dramatically, we need to consider the technical definition of GDP under European accounting standards, specifically the ESA 2010 rules. When a multinational transfers intellectual property, it is classified as fixed capital formation.
So what does that mean in simple terms?
In simple terms, this transfer is treated by official statisticians as a massive investment in the Irish economy or as a huge export of services. And crucially, the $300 billion that was transferred was, according to the sources, larger than the official estimate of Ireland's entire real, domestically driven economy at that very moment.
So it was a purely statistical anomaly generated by a spreadsheet entry.
That's all it was.
And alongside these high-profile IP transfers, Ireland also employs a parallel, less publicized yet equally massive financial mechanism. And this involves its absolute dominance in global aviation.
Right, the aircraft leasing industry.
Exactly. This mechanism originated far back with the establishment of the Shannon Airport's Free Zone, which was initially intended to defer taxes on manufactured goods.
And that initial policy decision unexpectedly laid the groundwork for Ireland's near monopoly in the global aircraft leasing industry. Today, Dublin-based firms, including major players like AerCap and Avalon, they own an astonishing, 70% of the world's commercial airliners?
70%. It's an incredible figure.
It is. The total stock of these planes is estimated to be worth over $1 trillion. And to put that figure into perspective, that is roughly 4 times the annual income of Ireland's true domestically driven economy.
4 times.
These leasing firms are located in Ireland because of the highly favorable tax structures and the existence of free ports, where aircraft can be registered and profits accrued with exceptional tax advantages. So the profits from these enormous leasing operations are recorded in Dublin, despite the fact that the actual aircraft rarely, if ever, touch down on Irish soil.
And this participation in global supply chains, it counts statistically as a services export.
Which further and significantly inflates Ireland's national output figures.
And furthermore, these multinationals gain a distinct, ongoing tax advantage through capital allowances, don't they?
They do. When they invest in an aircraft, which can be up to 15% of the aircraft's total value, Irish law allows them to claim 1/8 of the aircraft's total cost as depreciation against their Irish tax bill each year.
So it's another tax write-off.
A very large one.
And this depreciation allowance mechanism, according to specific reports cited in the source material, is estimated to save these companies approximately $14 billion in corporate taxes annually. It's a massive, structured incentive to keep the planes registered and the profits recorded in Ireland.
So the cumulative effect of these mechanisms, the IP transfers, the aggressive tax sheltering via the double Irish and its successors, and the aircraft leasing dominance is immense. Experts widely estimate that the financial economy built on international accounting is roughly the same size as Ireland's real domestically driven economy.
Which makes the entire system incredibly fragile and structurally vulnerable.
Extremely. And this structural instability is compounded by an extreme concentration of risk, which is perhaps the most precarious aspect of Ireland's current position. The sources underscore that Ireland's entire corporate tax revenue is just overwhelmingly reliant on these foreign multinational firms.
Oh, the dependency figures are breathtaking. Almost 90% of all corporate tax revenue collected by the Irish government comes from multinationals.
And within that already small group, the concentration is even tighter.
Right. Just 10 U.S.-owned firms contribute the vast majority of the total. And even more acutely, only 3 major U.S.-owned firms account for 1/3 of the country's entire corporate profit tax revenue.
1/3 from just 3 companies.
It's incredible. And this concentration creates an immediate, pervasive, and perilous political calculation for the Irish government, the inherent "don't bite the hand that feeds you" dilemma. And this pressure became acute when the European Union, which was determined to close these tax loopholes, attempted to force Ireland to collect billions in unpaid taxes from companies involved in the alleged tax schemes, most famously in the case involving Apple.
And the Irish government, however, was highly resistant to accepting this massive multi-billion-euro windfall. The calculation they faced was simple and profoundly stark. If they enforced the EU's demands and the corporations were compelled to leave or restructure their operations outside of Ireland, the consequences would be devastating.
What were the projections?
Analysts warned the government that 80% of their corporate tax income could disappear overnight. Furthermore, such a sudden exodus could trigger a staggering 10% drop in domestic employment.
So for a government still recovering from the 2008 crash and desperate to maintain stability, the risk of triggering an immediate economic depression by accepting the money, it was politically just too high to bear.
Way too high.
And this reliance has inevitably placed Ireland squarely in the crosshairs of a global movement aimed at combating tax loopholes and achieving, fiscal fairness. A significant challenge materialized in 2021 when the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, proposed a mandatory 15% global minimum corporate tax rate.
Which was a direct shot at Ireland's 12.5% rate.
It was. This initiative was a direct response to jurisdictions like Ireland, which had built their economic models around rates significantly lower than 15%. And under immense international pressure, Ireland did eventually agree to participate in the 15% minimum tax effort.
Although the sources indicate that the ultimate implementation details remain complex and politically contentious, as many of these established tax arrangements now need to be unwound.
And it's not just the EU or the OECD.
No, Ireland also faces targeted countermeasures from its largest trading partner, the United States. The sources point to the 2017 U.S. Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which lowered the domestic U.S. corporate tax rate from 35% down to 21%.
A huge drop.
It was. And this legislation was explicitly aimed at leveling the playing field and incentivizing U.S. companies to repatriate their profits back to the U.S. It was effectively entering the same tax rate lowering game that Ireland had mastered.
It signaled that the U.S. was no longer passive about having its corporate tax base eroded by foreign jurisdictions.
That's exactly right.
And even more recently, The stress has become fraught with geopolitical tension and direct trade threats. The sources highlight a very real stressor imposed by the threat of Section 232 tariffs on pharmaceutical imports to the U.S.
Which is a crucial sector for Ireland. It accounts for around 60% of Ireland's total exports to the U.S.
Right, and at the time, threats detailed that these tariffs, originally aimed at protecting U.S. industries, could escalate to a staggering 250% on Irish pharmaceutical products within 18 months.
An existential threat to that industry in Ireland.
It was. And this threat, emanating from the U.S. administration's trade representative, placed enormous and direct diplomatic pressure on major U.S. pharma companies operating in Ireland, like Pfizer and Merck.
And former Irish political leaders warned that if such threats materialized, and even if just 3 major U.S. firms were to relocate or significantly draw down their operations, Ireland could lose up to $10 billion in corporate tax revenue immediately.
Which just illustrates the precariousness of basing your national budget on the tax decisions of a handful of foreign-owned boardrooms.
It does, and this perpetual battle, where large economic blocs try to incentivize a corporate exodus from smaller jurisdictions, it highlights a critical, often cynical issue in modern geopolitics, the race to the bottom in corporate taxation. As the sources correctly point out, this race fundamentally only benefits the largest corporations who are, quote, cheating the progressively problematic game, while national governments worldwide lose out on necessary revenue needed for domestic investment.
So, given this extreme volatility and external pressure on its funding model, how is the Irish government responding to create a buffer?
Well, they are attempting to turn this volatile paper wealth into a tangible sovereign cushion. They recently established the Future Ireland Fund, a sovereign wealth fund designed to theoretically grow to $100 billion by 2035.
And this fund is explicitly backed by diverting 0.8% of excess corporate tax receipts, those unpredictable windfalls starting in 2024.
Which on the surface seems fiscally prudent. Setting aside unpredictable revenues to build long-term stability and resilience against future tax shocks.
But this decision also carries a geopolitical risk, doesn't it?
It does. The move risks isolating Ireland from the European Commission, which would have preferred Ireland to accept the tax windfalls from the various lawsuits and distribute them more broadly across the EU, perhaps to contribute to European-wide infrastructure or debt reduction initiatives. The perception is that by establishing this fund, Ireland is prioritizing its corporate allies by resisting the lawsuits and its own future resilience over immediate compliance with the EU's broader fiscal and fairness agenda. It represents Ireland doubling down on its economic model while trying to mitigate its inherent instability.
So now that we have established the complex mechanics of the make-believe economy, we must complete the circle of our deep dive and connect these abstract financial figures back to the lived experience of the Irish citizen.
Which is where the gap becomes most jarring.
It really is. Let us reiterate the core problem. The headline GDP figure of $145,000 per capita is profoundly misleading for the average person. It counts massive investment and trade balances heavily inflated by multinational operations, but the vast majority of those profits, which inflate the number, are quickly repatriated abroad. They never translate into domestic spending or infrastructure investment.
The sources estimate that well over 90% of the reported statistical wealth flowing through the country does not actually land in the pockets of its citizens.
It just flows through.
And to get a real picture of domestic stability, we have to turn to alternative metrics that economists have developed specifically to filter out the noise created by these multinational accounting distortions.
For example, average take-home income.
Exactly. If we look simply at the average take-home income, which is closer to $41,000, Ireland ranks more closely to countries like France or Italy, rather than sitting on those statistical leaderboards dominated by Luxembourg or Singapore.
A huge difference.
And recognizing this extreme distortion, economists developed gross national income, or GNI, which excludes profits returned to foreign owners. But even GNI was deemed insufficient, leading to the creation of an even more refined measure specifically for Ireland, GNI star, or GNI.
And this GNI metric is crucial for our understanding. It excludes not only the repatriated profits, but also the massive capital depreciation related to the multinationals' assets. And why is this important? Well, because the depreciation allowance, as we discussed with the aircraft leasing and IP transfers, is huge.
It is.
So by stripping out both the profits leaving the country and the non-cash allowances being claimed by multinationals on their assets, the GNI measure provides the clearest picture of the actual output and wealth generated by and for Irish residents.
And when you use the GNI measure, the real scale of the economy is dramatically reduced compared to the headline GDP. In 2019, for example, the GNI figure placed Ireland's economy 8th in Europe, which is a respectable position, but it's a monumental distance from the #1 ranking it holds on the misleading GDP lists.
Eighth is good, but it's not number one.
Not even close. And another crucial metric for understanding quality of life is actual individual consumption, or AIC. This measure tracks the consumption of goods and services by households and government spending on behalf of households. It literally measures what people are using and spending.
And on this AIC measure, the sources confirm that Ireland ranks 12th in the EU. This puts them behind not only the 6 original founding members of the EEC, but also many of the Nordic and Western European member states.
The conclusion is stark.
It is. There is less consumption per capita in Ireland than in the United Kingdom, placing Ireland closer to countries like New Zealand and Italy in terms of actual lived material prosperity.
And this failure of statistical wealth to translate into domestic stability is most dramatically and agonizingly felt in the housing crisis, which is the direct cause of the high youth immigration rates we noted at the very beginning of our deep dive.
It all comes back to that.
It does. The crisis has deep roots dating back to the initial Celtic Tiger. The construction sector represented 12% of the economy between 2000 and 2006, but it collapsed after the 2007 recession, triggering a deep housing market crash and subsequent global financial bailouts.
And the sector never really recovered.
Not fully. The structural deficit that exists today is severe. House prices in Dublin have nearly tripled since 2000, and critically, they have risen a brutal 70% in the last decade alone. To afford a normal home in Dublin today, an above-average wage is simply not enough. You would need to be in the top quartile of earners or have significant family assistance.
And this crisis is multifaceted. Post-2008, the construction sector suffered a massive brain drain as skilled laborers and tradespeople left the country seeking stability abroad. So the industry has not recovered to pre-crash production levels.
And the remaining developers are largely small to mid-size and struggle desperately to access necessary financing, compounded by complex planning systems and restrictive public land procurement rules. The supply simply cannot meet the demand.
And crucially, the sources point to specific policy decisions that exacerbated the problem: the financialization of housing. Following the 2008 crash, policies were enacted that actively encouraged large-scale institutional investment in the housing market, primarily through real estate investment trusts, or REITs.
And these institutional investors, sometimes operating under favorable tax treatment in strategic development zones, began treating housing primarily as a financial asset, as a commodity to be traded, rather than a basic necessity for citizens.
So they were competing directly with first-time buyers.
Exactly. They competed directly and unfairly with first-time buyers for entire housing estates, driving up prices and limiting the supply of secure, affordable rental stock.
The human cost of this housing crisis is undeniable and tragic. Dublin currently faces record levels of homelessness, with over 10,000 people recorded in emergency accommodation in August 2024.
And this suffering, this lack of affordability, brings us right back to our quiet hook.
It does. The crisis fuels the ongoing historical trend of emigration among Ireland's young, talented, and highly educated workers. They're not leaving because there are no jobs. They are leaving because they cannot establish a stable life or afford housing, despite living in one of the supposedly richest countries in the world. They are victims of the country's statistical success.
So as we conclude this calm and reflective exploration, we can trace Ireland's economic journey with, I think, a lot of clarity. It transitioned from an agrarian relic defined by depopulation, it struggled through decades of isolation, and then finally pivoted to become an industrial and high-tech success story.
A success fueled primarily by globalization and strategic tax cuts.
That's right. But we now understand that Ireland's statistical wealth, that $145,000 GDP per capita figure, is largely a luxurious foreign veneer. It is a sophisticated, highly concentrated financial structure that is disproportionately vulnerable to external political pressures, particularly shifts in U.S. legislation and global tax regulation. The Celtic Tiger is, for the time being, a paper tiger built on fragile ledgers.
It is essential, though, to maintain a balanced perspective. We have to acknowledge that the tax model did succeed in shifting the economy to a high-value knowledge base. It created high-paying jobs for a segment of the population, and it generated significant corporate tax revenues that have given the government a relatively strong fiscal position to weather shocks.
Especially compared to its historical struggles.
Absolutely. However, That immense statistical success has fundamentally failed to translate into a durable, self-sustaining domestic economy for its citizens. It has not solved critical domestic issues like housing and infrastructure, and critically, it has not finally broken the historical trend of emigration among its youth.
And this reliance on tax arbitration is clearly entering a new phase. External forces such as the OECD minimum tax effort, the threat of U.S. tariffs, and the growing political pressure within the EU are forcing a change to the way Ireland does business.
Regardless of the Irish government's desires to maintain the status quo.
Exactly. The game of the corporate tax race to the bottom is becoming increasingly untenable in the global arena.
Which leaves us with a final, provocative thought for you to reflect upon long after this deep dive concludes.
The essential question for the future of Ireland is this. Can the country successfully transition its core economic model, moving away from being the world's most effective, if ethically fraught, tax haven, to actually building a durable, robust, self-sustaining domestic economy that keeps its young population home?
Or will the paper tiger simply crumble under the growing weight of geopolitical tax battles, leaving the real, domestic Ireland exposed and once again reliant on emigration as its primary pressure release valve?